All right, man. Peace. So the D-level actor Michael Rappaport has recently started to make quite a name for himself, particularly in the woke circles of the internet, by chiming in on a lot of current events, particularly racially related current events. And as we all know, it's due to his, or those of us who have some context in regards to Michael Rappaport and know about his history, we know that it has to do with the fact that he's what you call, or what was called back in the day, a quote unquote Wigga white boy. He's one of these guys who will try to out nigga you. What do I mean by that? He's one of these guys who will try to go back and forth with you and try to see who can quote more hip hop lyrics. And, he's going to call you son and my dude and all this other stuff. Why is that? That's part of a role that he plays. A lot of people don't understand that Wigga white boy role is exactly that. It is posturing. He does not talk like that when he meets with Hollywood execs. You understand? That's not really him. That's a persona. But he says some things that are very interesting in this little video clip. And I think that it gives a little bit of insight and a little bit of perspective in regards to what makes someone like him tick, in regards to his attempt to understand the so-called black man and woman. And it also gives some insight into the very strange and tenuous and tempestuous relationship between the this form of liberal Caucasian, the Wigga white man, and the so-called black man, who most of them now are liberal, and also a lot of them are going into wokeism. So anyway, let's see what Michael Rappaport has to say.
Just listening to, hip hop, it's crazy how many, people out here love hip hop but hate anything that has to do with actual black people, or they love.
No, it's not really interesting, because hip hop is not really that hip hop is not is not a full encapsulation of the so-called black mindset. Back in the 30s and 40s, you had Caucasians who liked jazz, but they still had no problem calling a so-called black man derogatory terms or maltreating him. That's nothing new. In the 50s, you had Caucasians, young Caucasian kids who like rock and roll, and they also had no problem coming against so-called black people. In the 60s and 70s, you had Caucasians who liked Motown and the Philly sound per se, and they still had no problem coming against black people at large. My point is this: an appreciation for certain forms of quote unquote black creativity, that has nothing to do with how much you can respect, vibe with, or understand the issues that so-called black people go through, or the problems that our people have. So I think that the more pertinent thing to understand when you listen to Michael Rappaport is his belief that hip hop culture is black culture, and it's not. Because right now our people don't have a culture.
Of these athletes, but then they, are disgusted by their actions, in their protests. That to me is the craziest thing in the world. You would think one hand would sort of, move things forward, but you could love all these black things and then.
No, sir. I don't see the relation between people who are caught up in, once again, certain manifestations of quote unquote black creativity, and then co-signing the woke movement, which when he says white people, he's really talking about conservative Caucasians, because the liberal Caucasians not only are in favor of wokeism and the liberal blacks and their love of chaos, but they're the ones who are crafting and organizing the methodologies to use for the so-called liberal blacks to use. So he's really talking about conservative Caucasians, his issues with the conservative Caucasian. And, he's kind of framing it within his limited understanding of what black culture is to him. To him, as a Caucasian growing up in the 80s and late 80s and going into the early 90s, hip hop to him was a way for him to feel cool and to feel plugged in. When you really examine Michael Rappaport's career, he's always tried to cling on to that persona of, I wish that this could be me. That's really what the Wigger white man represents. He represents a person who wishes that he could be somebody else. He wishes, when he looks in the mirror, he wishes that he could be a so-called black man. But at the same time, he understands the advantages that he has as a Caucasian in this current society. So when he speaks about things like race in relation to hip hop culture, all he's doing is posturing. That's for his liberal black crowd. And there are a lot of so-called pro-blacks and internet revolutionaries that like Michael Rappaport. Believe me, I've seen the comments. These niggas are so simple. As soon as he says anything about race, they say, oh man, that's my man Rappaport. He's down. He has a hood past. Like that's how simple these niggas are, man.
Despise black people. That's crazy to me. You know, racism and race and the conversation about race is very important. It makes me uncomfortable. It makes every.
Well, wait a minute. If the conversation is so important, and you just finished saying that people who like hip hop culture should be, should respect the various liberal protests that are utilized by a certain segment of black people today, why does a racial conversation make you feel uncomfortable? You should be very comfortable with it. Particularly since you had a black female that you created kids with. Particularly since many of your movies, going from Zebrahead to what's the film that he did about the kid in college? Then he did another one with Spike Lee, Bamboozled. Every time you see him, he's popping up trying to play some form of a role where he is clinging on to or being closely associated with so-called black culture. And the Wigga Whiteboy is the person to watch out for the most because he wants to be you. Once again, he's the type of guy who will try to out nigga you. I know more lyrics than you. I could take your woman, so and so. Now, he was with a so-called black woman back in the 90s, and then he left her, and then he got with a Caucasian woman. But he still likes to play that role, that, yes, son, you know what I'm saying? Like he's still trying to get caught up in that role that he's playing. Oh, Higher Learning, that's the name of the movie. That's one of my favorite flicks, too. Higher Learning. I love when Omar Epps whooped his ass. That's my favorite scene when he caught Remy in the stairwell.
Everybody uncomfortable, but I try to just go head first into it. I think it's important. I ain't a social,
How could you go head first into a conversation about race when you don't even know what your race is? Well, Michael Rappaport, he will claim to know his race because he's a so-called white Jew. And that's my thing. How could you have a conversation about race when the conversations that you have are predicated on corporate designations? It's not even real race. You're talking about black and white. Those are not real races. So this is why people are constantly trying to engage these circular conversations that are going nowhere. But the reason why he's trying to push that and postulate that is because of his infatuation with the so-called black man. That's it. This man wants to be you. All of these internet revolutionaries out there who don't get that, man. It's sad. This man wants to be you, and you trying to congratulate him for making a lot of low-level observations that really just show that he views you as a cardboard cutout and a caricature. Oh, because he likes hip hop culture, he's going to co-sign the Black Lives Matter movement. He's another guy who's trying too hard. There's a great scene at the end of the film Rise of the Planet of the Apes when after Caesar leads the apes into the woods, and I'm going to go into that film in depth very soon, hopefully. All three films, hopefully very soon. And James Franco, who plays Caesar's handler throughout the film, he's still trying to get Caesar to come back home with him. And Caesar understands at that point what his real calling is. And Caesar grabs him and he whispers in his ear, Caesar is home. Why? Because he was with his own and he was leading his own. All right. It wasn't that he hated James Franco's character anymore. It was just he grew up. And if you notice in that scene, throughout the movie, he was crawling mostly on of course, on his legs and on his knuckles. But at the end of the film, when he met with James Franco, he stood straight up because that symbolized that he had come into his fullness. All right. When the so-called black man comes into his fullness, he's not going to feel the need to have these silly circular conversations anymore with the Caucasian. He's not going to be concerned with their validation. This man, Michael Rappaport, is trying to play into the understanding that he has that the black man wants his acceptance. And on the flip side, he wishes that he could be a so-called black man, not in this world, but just overall in general. He wishes that he could emanate that energy that the so-called black man can emanate.
Expert on things. I just go with my gut and my experiences.
Yeah, when he says he goes with his gut and his experiences, what when he says he goes with his gut and his experiences, what he's really talking about is all the black women he slept with and all the hip hop he's listened to. That's what he's talking about. He's not talking about any real experiences because he's never been a so-called black man. So how could you go by any experiences? Are you talking about the rapport that you have with certain two-dimensional thinking blacks that want you to like them while you want to be them? I mean, once again, you have to really truly understand that Wigga white boy spirit. That is a very, very serpentine spirit. And when I say serpentine, I mean on the left-hand side. Okay? That's like anybody else who you feel like is biting your style. When somebody wants to be you, eventually they want to be you to the point where they want to remove you. Just like the film, the Talented Mr. Ripley with Matt Damon. I did a video on that, very, very short video, because they snuck in the number 666 to exalt their Luciferian inspiration, the Bacchus. They snuck that little symbol in there, the 666, on the sail of the boat that they were on. But the film, The Talented Mr. Ripley, was about a man played by Matt Damon who became so infatuated with a certain person played by Jude Law that he wanted to be him. I believe his name was Dickie Greenleaf. He wanted to be him. This is the personage of Michael Rappaport. He wants to be the so-called black man. At least he did at one point. Right now, he still loves the energy of the so-called black man. But see, as long as you don't understand who you are as a so-called black man, it gives him the ability to come and try to be you. And I guarantee you, he'd be the same guy, Michael Rappaport, who would try to mock somebody of another quote-unquote race other than Caucasian, who said that they believed and followed the Torah. All right, and I'm not going to try to get into any type of biblical or spiritual conversation on that one. I mean, I'm not even just talking about a so-called black man. I'm just talking about anybody. I guarantee you, he would say, well, that they can do that, but this is really for us. You understand? See, it's one thing to have a conversation when you're doing it on the terrain that you feel like the conversation should be done on. Right? As long as you're having a racial conversation and it is constrained to black and white, then that's one thing. But now when you start talking about culture and real cultural appropriation, which is not what these woke fake pro-blacks talk about, people wearing braids and women getting butt implants, all that little dumb, silly, frivolous shit. I'm talking about real cultural appropriation, like you trying to steal people's history. Now that's a whole other issue. Okay? But anyway, I just thought that this little snippet was very interesting. Peace.